Our first meeting was in 1953. And tonight, I'm pleased to have Miss Jamie Black here with us. She just graduated, or one piece of paperwork away from graduating from the University of Central Florida, where she was a history department major, or a major in history. And she came to me, I guess it was around Christmas break, and wanted to find an internship for the spring semester for her department. And she was aware vaguely of the League of Women Voters, and she is from Broward County. And I said, go to it. We had organized the newsletters by year and month, but we hadn't done anything with them. And so essentially, Paige and I just gave Jamie our newsletters from the last, whatever, 60 some years from 1953. And she has been posting on her blog site since about the middle of January. And tonight she's going to be giving us a summary. And so I will turn it over to Jamie, who has a PowerPoint that she will be giving us. So thank you, Jamie.
Hi, everyone. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. All right, can everyone see that all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right, so just a little about me. As Monica said, I just graduated from the University of Central Florida. I was a history major and also minored in diplomacy and Judaic studies. And this was my first real internship. So it was a very new eye-opening experience for me, and I'm very, very grateful for it. This is just a little sample of what my blog looked like. It's one of my weekly blogs. I kind of just weekly went through and showed what I found. I went through it based on the years. So some of the newsletters were sorted between the 50s to the 60s, or 85 to 89. It really just depended on how much information there was. But with that sorting that was already done of the newsletters, that's how I decided what weeks to cover and what years. Certain times there was weeks where I would look at it and be like, I need 2 extra weeks for this blog because there's so much to cover. And I did find myself looking at a lot of the information and saying, wow, I could do a lot more with this. But this is just a big summary of what I found. I would say there's certain themes. So the topics that I'm going to discuss, they include environmental issues, reproductive rights, foreign policy or foreign relations, workers' rights, educational issues, and many more. Obviously, the League is known for its involvement with the Broward County library system, but I want to cover the lesser known issues that the League covered and highlight those in my presentation. But right before doing all of that, I just wanted to share pictures of the first meetings that the League had. On the left of your screen, see a clipping from the Fort Lauderdale News, and it's of one of the League meetings, and it's from 1959, and it's talking about how the League was promoting voters' knowledge among women. And then on the right is a picture from one of the early meetings, and it's a publication from the Miami Daily News in 1953. And it explains the first meeting that happened and some of the original members. And then continued here is also the beginnings of the League. On the left, it's the discussion of the League's formation before their first official meeting and the proposal to form a League. And at that point, it wasn't Broward, it was more Fort Lauderdale. So you can see throughout the records how it evolved to incorporate Broward County. And then on the right, it's from Good Housekeeping, actually. And it just explains more on a national level and everything, how the League functions, what's its goal, emphasizing the how it's a partisan organ, it's not related to one party or anything. So I thought these were really cool to really introduce the League's foundings and the first real introduction I had to the League in its foundings as well. So just to cover one of the big topics, of course, is the Equal Rights Amendment. The amendment was proposed in 1923 by Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman. It was to ensure legal rights to people regardless of sex. And it had traction, but it didn't really get attention from legislation in a big light, or to the point where it could actually be passed. It had this chance of being a reality. But I noticed through the records that in the 70s, it gained popularity again. And it was actually approved by the US Congress. And the Congress sent it to the states, and they gave them 7 years to ratify it on the state level. And if it was ratified, then it would come into being. So in terms of Florida, and what the Broward League did was they worked to pass the ERA, obviously. And they unfortunately didn't get any traction that in terms of actual legislation, but they did really advocate for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, and even appeal to broader audiences. It went beyond men and women, and it went to men. And the League really pushed for this effort that explained that, yes, the Equal Rights Amendment is going to be a change, but it would be a positive change rather than a negative change. And it wouldn't be something drastic that would affect men and completely change everybody's way of life. And the League actually quoted President Eisenhower, who said the amendment was a matter of simple justice. And I thought that was a really poignant piece, because it is a matter of simple justice, and it's an amendment we still don't have today. So it is very timely still, despite it happening 50 years ago about. So I thought that was very interesting. Moving on to another big rights movement was the civil rights movement. Going through the records, I was able to categorize into 2 phases, which was during and after the civil rights movement. The during is mainly during the 60s, and the Broward League's efforts during the 60s, as well as the National League's efforts during the 60s. So during the 60s, there were national efforts created by the League. And in 1962, Mrs. R.J. Phillips, who was the League of Women Voters national president, called the situation a crisis on civil rights, and addressed the principles that the League set forth in the past and how those principles need to be revisited in order to further the civil rights movement, and suggested that constructive action needed to be taken by the League of Women Voters in order to make a change. And overall, the national effort really emphasized that we're pushing for voter education and participation in civics, so that should be extended to minorities and not just white people. And additionally, into the emphasis on the crisis on civil rights, there was the creation of the Human Resources Committee. It was meant to explore local communities and any inequities that might be in local communities. The committee it wasn't just about segregation. It was expanded into education, poverty, employment, and how any inequalities or racial disparities impacted those fields. So they made sure it wasn't just a very isolated incident, it was culminating the whole system and how it does have a bigger impact. And then in terms of Broward's effort, the League did a civil rights survey covering the discrimination in schools, housing, jobs, transportation, recreation, and restaurants. And the survey was done by a League's member city commissioner observer. And the observer who worked with the League did the survey among city commissioners and a biracial committee. And they did find that there wasn't any discrimination between the issues. It's a matter of interpretation, I guess you could say, but that was the findings. But following the civil rights movement and the death of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968, the League dramatically increased their efforts. On the right, you can see one of the documentations. It's actually from the Broward Voters newsletter, and it is a effort made by the local league, and it really emphasizes getting involved with all members of the community and not just a certain aspect of the community, really reaching out to audiences that the league might have not had ties to before, and just acknowledging that maybe we didn't do this before, but we are going to make efforts from now and make sure everything is very representative of the whole community. One of the things that I really noticed in terms of the Broward League's efforts with civil rights was the action committee. And the committee was to promote civil rights and do other projects that did reach other community members and be very equal in effort. And those projects under the action committee included Project Park, Project Trash, Project Urban League, Project Vote, and Project Discovery. And all of those kind of looked at different aspects of the community and how certain communities might have faced different conditions, either because of their race or their economic standing. And it was very, I would say it reached out to as many people as they could, but also recognized that there was a system in place before that negatively impacted some people. And it was a clear recognition of that and an effort to better conditions and kind of remedy the wrong in a sense. One of the other issues that I would say kind of does fall under the civil rights and the efforts afterward by the League was juvenile justice. And the League really worked towards making sure that children in the juvenile system had better rights and were covered a bit better, and whether there were disparities based on gender or race and how those came into play when it came to the arrest of children. So that was another really interesting thing I found. And into another realm was migrant workers. Nationally, the League stressed the issue of the treatment of farm workers. And then locally, the Broward League also built off the national agenda. And they presented laws regulating migrant labor in Florida, education to migrant children, and other efforts that were all with the goal of bettering conditions for migrant workers. The Broward League, specifically in terms of migrant workers, did have a lot of efforts to promote better rights for migrant workers and a lot of legislation in Tallahassee on the state level. But one of the things that really stood out to me was the efforts at Markham Elementary School. And the League was very involved in making sure that there was equality in terms of better resources to the elementary school. It was a 90% demographic of migrant children or children of migrant workers. So there was a big emphasis on ensuring that they got better conditions in terms of supplies that were granted to them. Markham Elementary School was actually a educational programs that had industrial arts, home and family, and instrumental music. So it was a very creative outlet for migrant children, and the League wanted to ensure that there were all those opportunities and supplies that they needed in order to fulfill the goal of the school. In terms of action that the League took, they requested community help in order to support the school and providing facilities to migrant children or bettering the facilities that were already there. So that was definitely a very interesting issue. And I think today it kind of shows how Florida is still very, in the past and today, Florida is very influential in terms of immigration and migration and how there is that melting pot aspect and everything. So moving on to environmental issues, the environmental issues were a very big part of the League of Women Voters in Broward since its founding, in a sense. There wasn't a year that I could say that there wasn't an environmental issue covered. There was always advocacy for the environment and even other avenues of exploring the environment. On the right, you can see an article where the League of Women Voters looked to Native American culture in order to see how they dealt with environmental issues. And it was a second approach that they took to see maybe we could do things a bit better, or it's not just our way, we can look at other aspects, which I thought was really cool thing to look at, because even today, we only really look at the certain culture, more Western approaches to environmental issues. So it was very interesting to see the Native American impact. And then in terms of advocacy of environmental protections, the League really worked hard to establish mass transportation, which would save fuel and be more environmentally conscious. They worked with the Coastal Management Zone program in 1977, which recognized that the coast is very important environmentally, but also tourism, and it really was a big part of Florida's economy as well. So it realized that you need to protect the environment in order to protect the economy as well. So the League really joined with the Florida Coastal Zone Management Program in order to protect the coast and better our treatment of the coast. Another element was the safe disposal of waste, which included hazardous waste, and then encouraging transparent and clean energy support. One of the interesting things that I found was the recycling efforts and how the recycling efforts did change over the time. Following World War II, there was a better recognition of how recycling can help and how recycling helped the wartime efforts, so we could do it not in a wartime situation. So the League pushed for the recycling of car oil. So when you would get your oil changed, it would be recycled, and it was just a greater advocacy for recycling, being more conscious of what we're using. One of the things I noticed was a bigger issue that's still today, the use of like styrofoam containers and bottles, and how certain things would get a like refund if you returned it, which was an older program, but it still shows the League's advocacy for those recycling efforts. And then on to educational issues. The League covered a lot of educational issues. Between the 1980s to 82, a lot of the League's efforts focus on the desegregation of educational institutions. So through that, the League really focused on the magnet schools in Broward County and how magnet schools were used as a means to desegregate schools in South Florida and Broward County. So magnet schools, they were viewed as a voluntary means of achieving integration in schools. So it would combine people from all over or certain areas that might not be in that neighborhood area. And it was really an eye-opening experience for me because I attended a magnet school for high school and middle school. So I honestly had no idea that they were used in this like situation, and that's what part of the goal was of magnet schools. So it was very fascinating to learn about the efforts that were used for magnet schools and the League's connection to promoting desegregation. And then there's the matter of health services. The League covered a lot, and it is a very broad category in terms of health services. Obviously, there is access to health services and protections in terms of abortion, birth control, and on the right, you can see a flyer from 1986 for the march that was published in one of the newsletters encouraging support and the protection of access to those health services and protections. And then beyond that, and the element was the Clean Indoor Air Act, which was, it came into effect in '85, and it prohibited smoking in public places like hospitals, theaters, and business offices, which I didn't know it was that recently, so that was a little bit of a surprise. It's definitely something we take for granted today. So it was really cool to see the league's involvement in that. Additionally, there was the other actions that was related to mental health. The league really focused on promoting services for mentally ill people, and if there was any issues with that and how to better explore it. I noticed there were a lot of studies that were done on mental institutions and really covering what happened and the treatment of people there. I think one of the bigger focuses on that led to the what not led to, but was the result of the deinstitutionalization of mental facilities. And I think looking at the records, you could kind of see how it got greater attention, and there was a big focus on the treatment of mental illness. And it was a really interesting thing to look at the health services, because there was even proposals for reform and other aspects that we see today, as we still are fighting for these types of health services, and the league's advocacy for health services and protections to the right to health and everything date back to 40, 50 years ago. So it was really interesting element of the league's history. And then another thing that I was surprised by was gun legislation. Today, we see that gun legislation is a big deal. There's a lot of push for reform, and it's not a new issue for the league. It went back until, from what I found in the records, I noticed that it became more apparent in the 80s, and I wasn't entirely sure where it emerged from, but with my own research online and everything, I found out there was a shooting in 1984 that left 21 people dead at a McDonald's. And it was a point for the league where they started to see, like, this is an issue, we need to do better, and we can really advocate for some form of gun control or gun legislation. The leagues took part in the Sensible Citizens for Handgun Control, and it wasn't an abolition movement of guns or anything, it was just sensible. So it was a push to better things that happened following the 80s and really approach things in a sense that it would appeal to a larger audience. The league did support handgun control, and they, one of the quotes that I found was they supported the regulation concerning the purchase, ownership, and use of handguns, while balanced as nearly possible the individual constitutional rights with general interest and welfare in the community. So the league really understood that, yes, there is this need for gun control, but there's also the right to have guns. So I would say it took the part where it didn't want to join one party or join another, and really tried to bring some form of a middle ground into the standing, and with that probably gained better league member support because of it. And personally for me, I had no idea the league had, well, I would say I didn't have any idea that there was gun legislation dating that far back, which I would say is naive to think, but I think it definitely shows how it's an issue, and the league does have such a connection, which really shows that the league's involvement has been very involved over the years and covered a lot of issues that we still see today. And then these are little extras that I found. I couldn't really find a perfect one category for them, but I thought they were very interesting little clippings from the newsletters. On the left, you will see a plan for the Port Everglades, and that is from 1980, 67, 87. I'm sorry, I can't read that right now. But it was how the Port Everglades was being planned, and how there was going to be a hotel, the convention center, and other elements to the port, which I found very interesting, just because today we see that Port Everglades is under construction, and they're ripping down the whole convention center and really remodeling that whole area. So I found it kind of cool to see this is what's happening back then and what's happening now. So there's a nice little contrast. And then on the right, the publication was following the easing of tensions during the Cold War. It's from 1990, and it is an ad, in a sense, to travel with the League, which promoted going to the USSR, to China, other areas in Asia, and really looking at places that were communist countries before and still are today, but really encouraging this bettering of relations. And the League emphasized to look at things from their point of view and explore a bit better, which was something that I saw as a really cool document to see this is what's happened before. And it really represents the thawing of tensions between the USSR and America, and eventually the dissolve of the Soviet Union, which there was another ad later on also promoting the traveling to Russia, which really goes to show the League's efforts and recognition of foreign policy issues and how much of a weight that had. And as you can see, it was encouraged to go to countries that were originally seen as like the enemy or a different type of ideology from our own. And yeah, it was cool to see that. And then just to conclude it, saying I learned a lot would be an understatement, but I am very glad for the information I did learn. Up until when I went to college in Orlando, I lived in Broward my entire life. And I would say everything I learned, there was nothing that I was like, oh yeah, I knew that happened. It was a big eye-opening experience. It really gave me a better perception of Broward history and just an appreciation as well for the smaller history, I guess you could say. It's I would call it the type of history they used to dig a little to find, which is like going through the League newsletters. And it's not something that you can find if you Google it real quick or go on a Wikipedia page. It's harder to find history, but I would say that harder to find element makes it much more worthwhile and just something that you appreciate a lot more because it's your hometown, or it's just something that's a little bit more meaningful in a sense. So if you wanted to read my blog posts, they are there. I think they were sent out as well in the email. Lastly, I just want to thank Monica. I really appreciate her efforts and support through this. And also thank the League as a whole for letting me get this internship experience and go through the records. So that concludes my presentation.
Okay, cannot find my mute button. So are there any questions for Jamie?
I have a question. First of all, Jamie, that was awesome. I'm so impressed with what you presented and what I learned, and it was really eye-opening. I wanted to go back to when you first started on issues of racial justice, and you said that the League did some survey and determined that there were no problems. Is that what we found? I mean, can you revisit what you said there, because that was kind of interesting?
Yeah, in terms of that, it wasn't exactly a League survey themselves. It was the League reporting a survey that was taken by a League member.
Oh.
And the questions were to this city council and a city committee, actually. And they surveyed these committee members, and those were the results they found. I wouldn't entirely say they're truly representative.
Yeah. Because and this was in the 60s?
Yes.
Because there is no way that in the 60s that there was any form of equity at all. I mean, this was the South. This was so that surprises me, and it's somewhat like, so the survey was somewhat diluted in terms of what they wanted to see and what they wanted to admit. So that's interesting, but it does appear that the League did then take some progressive views of of racial issues, and so despite that. So I mean, I'm not sure how significant that was. It wasn't a league survey. It was like a league person reporting on somebody else's survey. Is that right?
It was a league member who took a survey,
Ah,
but they weren't of the opinions of the league, which
okay.
was where I'd say that reflects a bit better of how there was some issue and maybe cover up by the city committee to hide the segregation and injustices that were happening in Broward
Yeah,
County.
interesting.
But following the civil rights movement and any of the legislation that was passed and everything, that's when you start to see the league. I wouldn't say they didn't believe it before, but there's a greater understanding of civil
Mhm.
rights and acceptance and push for civil rights with the popularity aspect of it all and the overall acceptance. Because of course, it is hard to challenge the norm, especially in the South.
No. And you know, the thing is, in the 60s, you know, Broward County was really very much part of like this southern state, you know, a Confederate state. All these people from the Northeast didn't, and you know, all the in-migration didn't really occur until like later in the 70s. The population really changed. So in the 60s, you know, Broward was very different than it was 10 years later. So that's interesting. I don't know.
Yeah,
Everything that you observed was really interesting, and I think you had, you know, like a really. I love the fact that you didn't know the history, so that when you encountered it, you were like kind of an outside observer of the history. You know, like this thing about magnet schools. You went to a magnet school and you had no idea that might have been part of desegregation, or that might have been part of this effort to integrate the schools. I love the fact that you didn't know that, and that you discover this, and that, you know, so it's interesting. So thank you.
There's a question from Andrea Gibbons. From your research, what do you feel has contributed to the continued success of the League of Women Voters of Broward chapter over so many decades, as well as how this chapter has been able to remain incredibly relevant to date?
I would say in terms of the continued success, it definitely had to do with the league not taking to, I guess you could say, sided or partisan positions. It was very bipartisan and made efforts to include everybody. So I think that definitely helped the league in terms of continued success. And in terms of relevancy, I would say the issues that the league faced back even to the 50s, some of them stick around today. So I think the continuation of issues is really what helps to keep the things relevant and really link back to the past while also pushing for new issues and maybe a link to the past where you can see in terms of environmental issues, this happened before, and this is kind of the new connection to it, or a continued growth of the issue.
I think I found it so interesting that we still have the same issues. We have progressed. I mean, that was one thing that I initially, when she started her blog, I thought, oh my God, we haven't gone anywhere. But you could see, you know, bit by bit, oh yeah, we did do that. We have accomplished this. The US has moved forward on certain issues. But it did show, again, the history of Broward that, again, I wonder, you know, how many students in the system know the history of Broward County. It's like, why was the league working on migrant student issues? And it's because, I mean, when I came down here in 87, no, my husband came down in 79, you know, University Drive was the end of the world. And it was agriculture. And so you did have a lot of migrant workers and migrant children in the county. And now we don't have any of that.
Yeah, one of the areas that was really emphasized in the newsletters was migrant workers, but also in Pompano. there was
Yeah.
an explanation that there were a lot of people in Pompano, and today you really don't see any farms or anything of the agricultural realm around Pompano. So it was very surprising to see that go from a very agricultural area to have mainly just people living there and everything.
Yeah,
No, I know for a fact there is no agricultural zoning in the county anymore. It's all gone. Denise?
I've lived on and off in Broward County since 1957. And I
Wow.
want to tell you that, Jamie, there were things I just learned from your presentation, even though I've lived here the whole time, or not the whole time, but most of the time. And so I really appreciate the research that you did and to enlighten us all. And it is true that there was lots when in the early 60s, particularly, there was lots of agricultural areas. Davie was all strawberry fields. We used to go pick strawberries in Davie all the time. And University Drive was a dirt road. The first time I went to what was then Broward College, no, what was it called? Broward Community College in 1962. University Drive was mostly dirt road, a little bit of asphalt with lots of potholes. But it was really scary driving home there at night if you went to night classes.
Wow. Wow. So Jamie, what are you going to do next? What's your, you just graduated or you're close to graduating? What are your plans?
I'm going to work during the summer, and then I'm going to try and get a certificate in being a paralegal. So that is the next little venture, still continuing education in a sense, but going towards a very more professional aspect of it all.
Ricky, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was muted. I remember all the Graham dairies out on University Drive, out west in Dade and Broward. Senator Graham's family.
Bob Graham's family's dairies were out there, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mm.
I don't think there are any dairies left in Broward County.
No.
Yeah.
Something I remember about the league in the early years here was the Broward League. Well, particularly in Broward, the efforts to get the public library. I don't know how late the records you went through, Jamie, went, but maybe that may have been a little later.
The records started in the league's founding in '53. So I did definitely find that element, and it was, you could see their push for the library and the greater effort to really achieve that. And one of the interesting things I found was how after the library was funded, the league met at the libraries.
Yeah.
It was really cool to see their efforts, kind of the fruit of the labor element of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We still do, because it's free.
Yeah.
when we can.
Yeah, hopefully
when we
hopefully
could
by
be.
fall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Any other questions?
Well, I was really, your report depicted many positive things about the league. And I wondered if you had customized your presentation here for league members to make us feel good about the league. Were there things that you saw there that you were like, oh no, this is not good? I mean, were there negative things that you withheld from us because you didn't want to tell us the bad news about where we came from?
No, honestly, the only darker spot, I guess you could say, was the civil rights movement.
Yes.
And which we discussed, and looking at the context, it was definitely something I had to look at further and understand. Yes, Florida was a southern state. There was a deeper history beyond that. So that was a darker element. But I would say beyond that, the league definitely advocated for issues that we still see as being important today and still a very important cause.
I mean, I'm impressed how the league was so active on issues like the ERA and in women's health issues. I wish the league had been more proactive on civil rights, but I think you put that in context there. So
Yeah, for sure. And I would even say the league was, but beyond that aspect, the league was very progressive in its stances. It looked towards issues like global warming at a very early date. Too early, but I think it was between like the 90s and 80s. And I was honestly surprised to see such interest in the term global warming, because even today it's kind of a big word that some people are like,
right,
is
right,
it real, is it
right.
not? So
Yeah,
it was
some dispute it still today, and here we were talking about it, right?
Yeah.
exactly. So I would say the league's interest in global warming at that more early of a day in terms of our conversation on global warming today shows their progressive attitude and push to always be ahead in a sense of the next thing to have action for and really look at and examine.
It was during the 1980s that the fossil fuel companies caught on and decided, oh, we're going to adopt the playbook that the tobacco companies used to delay liability for so many decades, just pay people to deny the science. So that's when the opposition really arose.
Interesting.
Interesting. Well, there's lots of kudos for you in the chat.
Yeah.
And I just want to emphasize that also. I just thought you did a wonderful job in looking at our history. And as somebody mentioned, looking at it from an outsider looking in, not knowing that much, about us. And it was just fascinating to read your blogs. I really, really have enjoyed that. So
I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone else's very kind words.
okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And for some of you, I'll see you on Saturday. And just keep looking at our calendar, because there's lots of things that just seem to be popping up all the time now. Things are becoming active again. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.